The film industry has a long history of representing the U.S. Mexican borderlands in both sides of the border. Hollywood and also the film Mexican industry has capitalized on the region as it provides a wide range of controversial themes. According to a good colleague of mine, Norma Iglesias Prieto, she's one of the leading scholars in the field of Mexican border cinema. She said that more than 300 films have been produced just in Mexico between the early 1930s all the way up to the early 2000s. By the 1930s, Mexican producers were beginning to view the border as a profitable theme for Mexico's national film industry. The U.S. Mexican border region is the most frequently recorded landscape of North America. Since the beginning of commercial cinema, the border has been a leading or secondary character in dozens of movies, ranging from the obvious westerns and the drug trade to the less obvious horror, science fiction, and film noir categories. The border has been always connected to the most common themes that seems to repeat over and over for almost 100 years. That is the vicious cycle of migrants coming across and the drug trade. But there are new themes, for example, like sex traffic and the transnational crimes that have become the new center of these films. It is important to understand that the film industry in both sides of the border has played an important role in creating and strengthening border stereotypes. Those who are far away and not familiar with the border region have played a key role to an erroneous and biased interpretation of life on the border. The Mexican film industry also perpetrated the wrong idea of the border by misrepresenting the socioeconomic and political conditions of these border towns like Tijuana, Juarez, and many other towns along the border region that continues to carry that stigma. So according to Norma Iglesias, she breaks down the images and the cinema along the U.S. Mexican border in four main characterizations. Number one deals with the border as a natural place for migrant workers. It represents the land of opportunities, but at the same time, the land of suffering. So for many migrants coming into the border, it becomes an unknown place. But at the same time, after so many years have gone by and you are in the U.S., then the temptation of becoming an American, a gringado. And we see these roles in some of the movies. These are examples of film productions from Mexico. La Chinilaria, Adiós mi chaparrita, Goodbye my little one in 1939. Pito Pérez, Se va de bracero. Pito Pérez becomes a bracero. 1947, Espalda Mojada, way back in the 1950s. El Fronterizo, The Borderman in 1952. So these films reflect the first wave of migration in the 30s and 40s into the U.S. So when we refer to the land of suffering, what migrants go through when they're closing the border, these two films from Mexico, we can see how distorted the images are. For example, you have this voluptuous woman perhaps crossing Rio Grande and she gets apprehended by the border agents. But in reality, who crosses the border on a bikini and have an amazing body like this woman? And it looks like she's being sexually harassed by the border agents. Once again, these images are coming from Mexico City. The other film is Tres Veces Mojado, Three Times Wet Back. It tells the story of this woman who gets apprehended 3 times when trying to come across the U.S. Mexican border. The second characterization is the border as a brothel and tavern, a place filled with gangsters and prostitution, and the natural place for drugs. The Mexican border has perhaps the most notorious reputation for vice, decadence, and unlawful activity. If you go back to 1920s, the stereotype of Mexican border towns as Sodoms and Gomorrahs was added to the already long list of negative images of Mexico. In the 20s, we have the implementation of the National Prohibition Act, also as the Volstead Act. So in the 20s, the production and sale of alcohol was outlawed, which led to a booming tourism in the border towns on the Mexican side during the age of Prohibition. So during Prohibition, many border towns became heavens for Americans seeking good time, drinking, gambling, and related activities. And it's this during this time where Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez become notorious for these places where Americans can go and have fun. So this idea of the border towns as a place where there's no law gets even more reinforced during the 80s, where you have all these movies that are actually coming from Mexico. For example, El Asalto in Tijuana, The Assault in Tijuana. And then as we go into the 90s and the 2000s, you have more films that continues to carry the stereotype of a region full of violence, drugs, and prostitution. In contrast, Hollywood border productions were not really about migrant experience or the chaos that was happening because of the drug trade. They were more concerned with fortifying U.S. national identity during the times of cultural transition. So border films provided a vital history of the United States through key cinematic movement from the birth of the nation after the American Civil War, the post-World War II era, the Civil Rights era, the Reagan era, the 90s, the 2000s, and we continue with all these films that talks about more as closing our borders, making sure that the element of Mexico, which is criminalized, do not enter into the U.S. The third characterization deals with Mexicanos from the U.S. side of the border, as they call it el otro lado, the other Mexico. The stereotype of the pocho, the Mexican American or the Chicano who's Americanized, who barely speaks any Spanish. And we see these roles in some of these Mexican films or Mexican film productions. So in some of these film productions, especially Mexicans, deals with the process of questioning cultural identity. Films like Primero Soy Mexicano, I am Mexican first and foremost, this is in 1950. Soy Mexicano de acá y de este lado, I am Mexican from this side of the border. La Güera, Xochitl, and this stereotype of the Mexican women who embodies two types of women. The Güera, the blonde one, who's more free, liberated, and the brown Mexican woman who's more traditional. We also have in those films the temptation of the blonde, that fantasy of a Mexicano Mexican male trying to hook up with an Anglo woman. And the fourth characterization is the one that deals with the border as a dusty and lawless town. And this is the beginning of Hollywood making a lot of money out of these Western movies. It is in this Western and rustic comedy where the image of the Mexican bandit is one of the most abiding stereotypes of Mexican in Hollywood history. The Mexicano becomes a symbolic center, perhaps he's the negative icon of this borderland narrative. So in the early days of Hollywood cinema, the Hispanic bandit is crazy, despicable, who must be punished for his brutal behavior. In most of these films, the image of the Mexicano, he is treacherous, he is dishonest, his reactions are emotional, irrational, and he relies on violence. He lack of intelligence, and at times he looks dirty, usually displaying an unshaven face, missing a tooth, and with a greasy or oily hair. If we circle back, the image of the bandido, the bandit, still exists in two incarnations as a Latin American gangster, the drug runner, as the inner city gang member in numerous urban thrillers and crime dramas that we can see. Latino juvenile delinquents can be understood as the continuation of the old stereotype as the bandit, or the bandido urbano, the urban bandit. In contrast to the feminine or the female image of the bandit, She's sexually promiscuous. She's a loose woman, typically a prostitute. Border films usually center their narrative on a single male protagonist. In closing, since the inception of cinema, the Hollywood motion picture industry has really manipulated the borderlands to tell a story about the U.S. dominance in the American hemisphere. Hollywood has often exploited the trope of the southern border between the U.S. and Mexico to capture a range of American ideals and values: integrity, moral clarity, industriousness, survivalism, confidence, and self sufficiency, among others. When we talk about these border regions in terms of cinema, with more than 30 million people living in this corridor, is no man's land, neither American nor Mexicano. It is more of a hybrid civilization with its own politics, language, and tradition, where nowhere else in the globe do two more polarized nations surrender their identities, giving place almost to a new world.